Hello, I'm Rob Matheson. This is the News Hour live from Doha. Coming up.
We prefer this to be a peaceful operation, but are locked and loaded to defend our people, our ships, our aircraft, and this mission without hesitation.
U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth says the Iran ceasefire is still in place, but warns against any Iranian aggression. The UN Refugee Agency says the humanitarian crisis in Lebanon is getting worse despite last month's ceasefire. Sudan's army accuses its neighbor Ethiopia of allowing what it says are UAE drones to be launched from its territory. And Russian drones and missiles target Ukrainian gas plants and rail facilities, killing at least 5 people. The U.S. Secretary of Defense has warned Iran that more strikes will result in the use of devastating firepower. It's the latest escalation between the two sides over control of the Strait of Hormuz, a vital waterway for global energy supplies. On Monday, 3 Indian nationals were injured when a fire broke out at a UAE petroleum facility in Fujairah. The UAE government said it intercepted several Iranian missiles. Earlier, Iran's foreign minister said there's no military solution to the political crisis and that the U.S. should be, quote, wary of being dragged back into a quagmire by ill-wishers. Speaking to media in Washington, D.C., Hegseth said the U.S. will retaliate against any Iranian attacks on civilian ships with strikes of its own.
To what remains of Iran's forces, if you attack American troops or innocent commercial shipping, you will face overwhelming and devastating.
The UAE 3 times, including an attack on Fujairah oil terminal, which was successfully defeated. They also launched cruise missiles, drones, small boats at U.S. forces defending commercial shipping in the Straits, and United States Navy MH-60 helicopters and Army AH-64 Apache helicopters successfully defeated those threats.
Well, the comments come as the United Arab Emirates strongly condemns what it called Iranian attacks on its shores. On Monday, 3 Indian nationals were injured when a fire broke out at a UAE petroleum facility in Fujairah. The UAE government said it intercepted several Iranian missiles. Tehran has released a map outlining a large part of the Strait of Hormuz, which it says it controls. According to the U.S., a number of ships have passed through the strait under the protection of its navy, which Iran denies. Washington says it's destroyed 7 Iranian military boats for trying to interfere. Iran says the U.S. hit 2 civilian boats, killing 5 people. Malik Train is joining us now from Doha. What are you hearing today? We've had these attacks that we were just talking about at the UAE.
Well, just in the last 2 hours or so, the Ministry of Defense in the UAE said that it sounded the alarms and for people to seek a safe place, and that any sounds they heard were from successful interceptions. This is the 2nd day in a row that the UAE has been targeted, and this is a dangerous escalation for people here. People are on edge because we know back when in this 40-odd-some day war, the Gulf was targeted by Iran with more than 6,000 ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones. According to the International Energy Agency, more than 80 oil facilities were damaged in those attacks. You talked about Fujairah. Fujairah is extremely important for the UAE. They have a pipeline that reaches the Fujairah oil, and they're able to export their oil, circumvent the Iranian blockade, and export their oil, circumventing the Strait of Hormuz. And we've also seen, Gulf countries condemning the Iranian attacks yesterday. Statements from Saudi Arabia, here in Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait. Nobody wants a return to hostilities. The call from the Gulf has been consistent. They've been calling for de-escalation. Nobody believes that there's a military solution. We've seen numerous statements in the last 12 to 24 hours saying that Gulf countries will be helping the Pakistanis in their mediation efforts to de-escalate, to bring both the U.S. and Iran back to the negotiating table. People here on edge, but are hoping that diplomacy can prevail and a comprehensive solution that brings stability to this region will take effect as soon as possible.
Malik, thank you very much indeed. Malik Trainer there talking to us from Doha. US President Donald Trump's been addressing media at the White House. He said despite what Iranian officials say publicly, negotiations are going well behind the scenes.
Iran wants to make a deal. What I don't like about Iran is they'll talk to me with such great respect, and then they'll go on television, they'll say, we did not speak to the president. We did not, I just spoke to, we did not speak to the president. So they play games, but let me just tell you, they want to make a deal. And who wouldn't? When your military is totally gone, we could do anything we want to them. Who wouldn't?
I'm going to bring in our chief US correspondent, Alan Fisher, who's at the White House. So we did hear similar themes from Donald Trump there. But at the same time, there was a sense of frustration, particularly with regard to the negotiations.
Or perhaps even an acceptance of the realism of the situation. Certainly the White House has said in the past, and Donald Trump has said in the past, that the Iranians say one thing for domestic consumption and international consumption, and they tell them something different on the phone when they are negotiating. Donald Trump says there is no breach of the ceasefire at the moment. He was asked whether or not the attacks by some of the Iranian small boats, as they call them, would be a breach. He said not at the moment, and then asked what would a breach be. He said you'll find out, and they know. The Iranians know what a breach would be. And so that's a concern going forward, given that this could blow up very quickly from a very small incident. But he says the Iranians don't have any guns, so they don't seem to be a threat at the moment. Donald Trump really just kind of marking time in the situation with a lot of the things he talked about. He was asked again about the price of oil here, how much it costs to fill up a car. He said it's a small price to pay. We've heard that before, to stop Iran getting a nuclear weapon. And he says Iran wants to make a deal. Who wouldn't, given the situation that they're in? It's interesting that Donald Trump, backing up what Pete Hegseth was saying in a news conference at the Pentagon a couple of hours ago, that the incidents on the Strait of Hormuz don't raise to the level of there being a breach of the ceasefire. But clearly it's something that the United States is keeping under review. Clearly, with all the military there is something that they could spark again. Kinetic activity, bombing essentially, could restart very quickly again. And there's reports here in Washington, D.C. and also in Israel that Donald Trump is considering a short 2 to 3 week resumption of attacks to try and force Iran into negotiating. But it's clear he believes that Iran wants to get a deal. He thinks it's moving in the right direction. We know there's back and forth going on using the Pakistanis as mediators. So Donald Trump just essentially marking the situation where we are at the moment, that there is a ceasefire of sorts, there is no peace of sorts, there is no war of sorts. This is really at a stalemate, and many people here will tell you that that's not something that continue. There has to be a breakthrough, either with peace or a new attack from the Americans at some point soon.
It's our chief US correspondent, Alan Fisher, outside the White House. Well, joining me in the studio is retired US General Mark Emmett. He's also a former Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs. I appreciate you being with us, General. Thank you very much indeed. Alan was saying that one of the things, and I would imagine there are several options that Donald Trump has been briefed on, would be the possibility of a 2 to 3 week option to take some sort of action inside, military action inside Iran in order to force Iran into making a deal. Given the way that we have seen both sides operate in the run-up to the situation we have now in the Strait of Hormuz, do you think that option would work?
You know, I've seen two other wars in this region, first Gulf War, second Gulf War. Both talked about shock and awe, that somehow we could stun an enemy into either surrendering, or in this case, it would be to compel the Iranians back to the negotiating table. I wouldn't put money on it.
Alan referred to it there as what we were hearing from Donald Trump is essentially marking time. And we are getting a sense now that because there is very little movement other than the military activity that we've seen in the Strait of Hormuz, and certainly in terms of the diplomacy, both sides seem bedded in. Does that make the possibility of a misjudgment greater or weaker or lesser, particularly when it comes to the very crowded Strait of Hormuz?
Well, first of all, I would comment on one thing you said, that there's very little movement and nothing is happening. It's clear in the backdrop Operation Economic Fury is happening, it's clear the United States is continuing to drag out the Iranian economy. You want to buy a loaf of bread, you have to carry a wheelbarrow full of Iranian money to do so. So I think they're counting on this multi-prong operation, we call it DIME, diplomatic, information, military, and economic, to sort of, you play one part at one point, you play another part at another point. Right now, the military is not at the front of the effort. Miscalculation, you and I have talked about that for weeks now. There's always that chance. And for example, if those 6 speedboats that had come after the American ships had been successful, or as the president said, they've been firing rockets at our aircraft carriers in the dozens, if any one of those had been successful, defined as either American casualties or significant damage, I think that would kick things off again. Now, the danger is the Iranians talk about the mosaic theory. What they mean when they distributed their chain of command. So if you lost the Ayatollah, if you lost any other significant leader, they would still have nodes of chain of command. They also use the mosaic theory for the military chain of command. So you could have some knucklehead speedboat commander of 15 or 20 decide that he's going to show everybody how tough he is. And that's the kind of miscalculation I'm concerned about, because they have such a distributed military chain of command that they really let those guys on the ground make their own decisions.
On that basis, then, given what we've just been discussing, that, as you were saying, that there is an assumption that there is a diplomatic effort that's ongoing at the moment between the US and Iran in some form or another. Nevertheless, we're seeing Iran carrying out attacks on shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, but also the UAE saying that it's being trying to defend itself against attacks from missiles and from drones. Does that lend itself to the suggestion that there is a split in the leadership, or at least the control structure within Iran, that, as you suggest, there are the negotiators on one side who are trying to make a deal, but there are people who are acting independently who want to take a completely different path?
I think we'll have to wait and see. That's been one of the great debates as well for the last couple of weeks, since Mojtaba is no longer on the scene. They don't have that head that makes the final decision. I think that's one of our great worries, because it would bring around that miscalculation you talked about.
General, thank you very much indeed. General Mark Hamid, former Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs. Thank you very much. Well, as tensions rise in the Strait of Hormuz, the consequences continue to be felt globally. The International Monetary Fund chief, Kristalina Georgieva, is warning that if the war continues into 2027, it's likely to see growth slow while inflation rises. This is all having devastating consequences for the world's poorest people. Laura Khan takes a look.
There are conflicting accounts between the US and Iran as tensions flare again in the Strait of Hormuz. Both sides trying to control this critical waterway. Now, the US said on Monday that 9 ships were able to get through that strait, and they were being supported by US naval vessels. It also said it destroyed some of Iran's attack vessels, and it's likely referring to these. They are armed speedboats known as its Mosquito fleet. Now, Iran denies this, saying the US attacked civilian vessels. And it released a new map claiming control of more of that strait. But the longer this drags on for, the greater the global impact. The head of the International Monetary Fund says if this continues into 2027 and we have oil prices of around $125, then you can expect a much worse outcome. And the World Bank says energy prices could soar this year by around 24% and commodity prices around 16%. And that feeds through, meaning everyone from families to farmers are paying higher prices for fertilizer, food, fuel, and also transport. Now, Asia took the first hit as its economy relies on around 85% of Middle East crude oil. Now, the Philippines had declared a state of energy emergency. Vietnam is highly dependent on that fuel, and Indonesia, Malaysia and Thailand are paying subsidies to absorb the shock. And China says it has a buffer. It says it has around 225 discoveries of oil and gas fields in the past 5 years. But in Africa, the crisis is worsening, a humanitarian crisis. In Somalia, 6.5 million people face acute hunger, with aid shipments still stuck in the strait. Now, the World Bank says it's the poorest people who are paying essentially the highest share of income on food and fuels, and they're going to be hit the hardest. And the World Bank has a reminder that as the conflict continues in Hormuz during this ceasefire, that war only serves to push development back while fueling further instability.
Alexander Hideshanu is a military and diplomatic analyst as well as a maritime security expert. He's joining us here in the studio. Very good to have you with us again on Al Jazeera. We were just talking with General Kimmitt earlier about the apparent hiatus that we're in at the moment with regard to the Strait of Hormuz and the Iran war. Generally, our correspondent Alan Fisher described it as the president essentially marking time in the statements that he was making just a few minutes ago, coming out with the same lines all the time, but a level of frustration with the diplomatic process. What's your assessment of this? And is there a chance, do you think, that this marking time, this pause or hiatus